Sri Aurobindo is describing the first phase of preparation in which the soul and the instruments must become fit before the second phase of actual illumination and realization can take their rightful place. And for this preparation, the first necessity is the purifying of all the members of our being, and especially for the path of integral knowledge, the purification of the understanding. And here Sri Aurobindo uses the word understanding as the closest English equivalent of the Sanskrit term buddhi. And the buddhi itself he describes both in its lower functioning and its higher. So first of all he says, by this understanding or buddhi, we do not mean the sense mind, which is only that part which is recording the perceptions, does not give to them any sense of rightfulness or wrongfulness, distinguish between illusory phenomena or actual. It does not include also the confused rendering that takes place of these perceptions, which does not involve higher judgment or discrimination, nor does it involve the constant leaping current of habitual thought. And this current of leaping habitual thought, which takes the normal place of the true functioning of buddhi in the common man, all it does is produce a repetition of habitual associations, desires, prejudices, prejudgments, etc. This is the band of consciousness which he describes only one removed from the animal, in which a large mass of humanity tends to live. It requires already some development of the intellect to be able to rise above this, to not be subservient to habit and desire and the senses. And this is necessary even as a first level of proper scientific understanding or philosophical knowledge, or even eventually spiritual knowledge. But what we are looking for is something which goes beyond this. And for the proper functioning of the buddhi itself, this layer, which is often taking its place, must be taught to be silenced or must be transmuted into the true understanding. And the nature of this true understanding also we read last time. The parts of it, in its purity, the true understanding is able to stand back from objects, observe disinterestedly, put in right place in the whole picture, which it does not lose sight of, by comparison, contrast, analogy. Then reason from this observed data by deduction, induction, and inference. And whatever it has reasoned, it should store in its memory and supplement the memory by rightly guided imagination, and all this functioning to be overseen by trained and disciplined judgment. I am reviewing these keywords because he will show us how these very functions are replaced by a higher operation of buddhi, as we will see shortly. But you see, this functioning is critical to the proper utilization of buddhi. If any of these things are not there, then the buddhi is mixed with the lower working of that habitual impulsive tendency, and we know it has been compromised. The yogic tradition repeatedly reminds us of the criticality of the purity of buddhi. In the Bhagavad Gita, it says, Smriti Bhranshat Buddhi Nasho. From the loss of the remembrance. The remembrance here is of the higher things, the deeper background against which we place our life journey. By the loss of that remembrance is the destruction of the buddhi, and buddhi nashat vinashyati. From the loss of buddhi comes all destruction. Or there is a popular saying, vinasha kale viparita buddhi. When it is time for destruction, the buddhi gets perverted. So the saying reminds us that it is this faculty among all faculties which prevents us precisely from going astray, which prevents us from doing that which is wrong or harmful, because it shows in clarity the greater truth and puts all things, however attractive they may appear, in their right place in the larger reality, in a higher perception. So Sri Aurobindo summarizes the functioning of this buddhi. Such is the pure intellectual understanding of which disinterested observation, judgment, and reason are the law and characteristic action. But this only describes the intellectual understanding and is the lower buddhi. He then brings our attention to the higher buddhi, which is not intelligence but vision. It is not understanding but rather an overstanding in knowledge. That is, it takes that station where it sees all things, views and controls from above, because knowledge itself is its power. And it does not seek knowledge and attain it by subjection to data. It already possesses the truths and brings it out in the terms of a revelatory and intuitional thought. And then he describes how human mind is able to come close to this when there is a very intense stress of thought and electrified by discharges from behind the veil, where a kind of a higher inspiration leaks through. And there is this power of inspiration and intuition in us, which mediates between a still higher knowledge, domain of knowledge, and the surface intellectual functioning. But this intuitional working, as we saw last time, is still imperfect and intermittent. And it comes normally only in response to an intense laboring effort of the mind or struggle of the heart. And it comes in response, and by the time it comes and enters the mind, we have already seized and distorted it because of our habitual expectations and needs into which the higher knowledge has to be made to fit. And all this happens within us without our conscious awareness. When the intuition comes, by the time we have become aware of it, of its content, it has already got distorted. And this is why all of the preparation of training of the mind starts with learning to quiet the mind or even silence the mind at will. Because it is only in that stillness of inactivity that we can distinguish something higher entering the mind, and distinguish when this inactivity moves into habitual reaction or action and distorts what comes. And if we have trained ourselves to be able to observe this, we can further train the mind to remain quiet so that the true intuition can come, can be received, and can be allowed to unfold itself without mixture of our own things. So now this is the challenge before us, and we read the next paragraph. If this higher buddhi could act pure of the interference of these lower members, it would give pure forms of the truth. And it's very simple. If somehow this separation can be made and this higher faculty can act purely. So what would it be when this higher faculty acts directly? And this is the rest of the paragraph. And you'll see all the keywords which we had read earlier in the description of the functioning of the lower buddhi. All of these powers will now be described in their higher functioning, or rather their higher principle of which they are a lower functioning. Now he says, first, observation. Observation would be dominated or replaced by a vision, which could see without subservient dependence on the testimony of the sense mind and senses. I will read the whole thing so we get a quick big picture and then we will come back to details. Imagination would give place to the self-assured inspiration of the truth. Reasoning to the spontaneous discernment of relations. And conclusion from reasoning to an intuition containing in itself those relations and not building laboriously upon them. Judgment to a thought vision in whose light the truth would stand revealed without the mask which it now wears, and which our intellectual judgment has to penetrate. While memory too would take upon itself that larger sense given to it in Greek thought, and be no longer a paltry selection from the store gained by the individual in his present life, etc. So you see already here a quick list of all of these key powers of the lower functioning of buddhi, described now in terms of the higher functioning. We look at each of these in some detail. To a first cursory reading, some of this might appear to be quite abstract, because offhand in our normal working of the mind, we do not easily experience these things. But the fact is, and this is the important point, all of these things are already happening at an inner and higher level, subliminal to our awareness, because of which the lower working of the buddhi is possible. So when we just take the example of memory, and I ask you simply to remember, do you remember when you were 5 years old or 10 years old? Or do you remember when you went to such and such a class? Do you remember when you first met so and so person, let's say some teacher who was to have a strong influence in your life, whatever it is? Your mind turns inward. Observe what happens. Your mind turns inward. And then it's like it looks around and pop, the memory comes. You did not actually go inside the store of memory and scan through all the events which were there. If you tried at that point to try to remember your memory, you would say, oh, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this, it's not. How far would you go back? You would have gone through millions of memories and then, oh yes, perhaps it is this. Is it actually this? None of that happens. You only turn in and as if wait for the memory to come, and the memory pops up. And when it pops up, you know what it is. Yes, this is it. So what happened? Where did it come from? Who went inside the store of the memory and pulled it out and popped it up to you? We are unaware of it. But in fact, it is this higher faculty which is doing the real work, in any case, behind the scenes. And it's like in the scene of the theater drama, you are supposed to say something, you don't know what to say, you've forgotten, and someone behind the curtain who has the full script whispers, these are the words you have to say. You hear it and you repeat. Behind the screen, who it is, you do not know and you don't care. What script he holds, it's not in your hands, but he has the entire script of the whole drama. You only know your part. But the whole thing is waiting there and watching you. It knows you, even if you can't see it. And when you turn and look askance, what am I supposed to say next? It responds to you immediately. So in the same way you turn in, where is that memory? It fetches the memory and pops it out to you. In other words, it's actually watching you all the time. And the moment you say there's a need to remember something, it does the remembering and pulls it out. And then once in a while something strange happens. I remember this. Wait. It's on the tip of my tongue. Hang on. It'll come. You remember it. You know that you remember it, but what it is you remember is somehow not coming through the curtain. It's like somebody is whispering, but you can't hear quite clearly what he is whispering. Somebody reaches out through the curtain and pushes you, but because of the thickness of the curtain, you can't quite make out how many fingers are being pushing through. So there's a gap in between, a layer of consciousness which is somehow clouded, preventing the memory from popping forward. But the memory is found, it's already held, but not being registered in your surface functioning. If you observe this, you realize the real problem actually is only this transparency or the transmission of the in between the actual deeper inner higher functioning and the surface superficial reflected functioning. And if somehow that layer in between could be removed, the whole thing would just bloop, come forward. It would act. How would it act? And this is the description. So now when we look at it in this way, and we're going to try to do that for each of these examples, we will notice that in fact all these operations are not new to us. They are in fact happening inside us. We just never paid attention to it, or we were not fully aware of it, but they were still happening. So first he says, let's see the whole text. If this higher buddhi could act pure of the interference of these lower members, it would give pure forms of the truth. And what are these pure forms? The pure form of observation first. Remember, the lower functioning of buddhi looks out, observes dispassionately, standing back from the objects, and then puts in the right place in the whole picture. And it puts in the right place by comparison, contrast, analogy, and reason, and analogy. Comparison, contrast, and analogy. These are the means by which it looks at how this fits in the overall, but still there's a big picture, and it observes something, fits it into that big picture. Now the pure working of the higher buddhi, observation would be dominated or replaced, and we will see both examples. Dominated or replaced by a vision which could see without subservient dependence on the testimony of the sense mind and senses. Now, sense mind and senses are what give you the inputs, the information for the observation and for the things against which you have to compare, contrast, or make analogy. So the senses first give you some observation. Let's take the example of a common example we took last time. You see a rope on the ground, but in the dusk, it is evening, you are not seeing very clearly. At a distance, something is there which looks like a rope. There is that input first, and then there is something else which kicks in, which is part of the functioning of the sense mind, and association. This looks like a snake, the way it is laid out. It is too harmonious. A rope would have some crookednesses. Or there's a kink in the rope. That kink is too tight. A snake's spine would break. I've never seen a snake that tightly coiled, so it can't be a snake. So you see there's a comparison with past memories, and then the thing which you have observed is placed in relation to that. Is it a rope? Is it a snake? Is it a line drawn by chalk or paint? And then the next step after comparisons comes the thinking out. If it's not a snake and it is put in this odd way and it was not there before, how did it come? Why is it there? Is somebody playing a practical joke on me? And all of these thoughts come, again looking at past memory and arranging in relation to them. Oh yes, I know, this person often likes to play a practical joke. He tries to scare people by throwing plastic snakes or creating fear. Probably it's a joke. So all of this is the putting in context through comparison, contrast, analogy in the big picture, using this lower powers, the testimony of sense mind and the senses. But this is completely replaced by a vision which could see without dependence on these things. Or the vision sees directly, or at least the vision dominates what you are seeing. Now, what does that mean and how does this work? The person looks at that, the physical senses give a picture. Before even the sense mind can throw its associations, there is this direct seeing as if of an inner sight that sees what it is, why it is there, what purpose it serves. I would like to give a few examples, but we'll take a few radical examples first, the type which we would not always be able to do. When mother went to inaugurate the cottage industries complex, everything had been arranged for her. She was to cut ribbons, things had been cleaned, neatly placed because people knew that this was important for her. She went in and rather going to all the neatly kept areas, she walked straight to a corner where there was a shed and went and opened the door where everything had been dumped pell-mell. So in their hurry to make it look clean for the mother, they had swept aside everything, dumped everything in that little shed, and they thought, that's it. Now we have created a clean appearance for the mother. She saw right through to what's behind. It did not need for her to make an effort to think out or to want to see more. In the very act of seeing, this higher vision kicks in and pop, it's there. It's obvious. This is the context. This is how it is. All things have been put there. So the observation is dominated by this vision which can see without dependence on the sense mind and senses. So the physical observation is overwhelmed by this higher vision, or even entirely replaced by the higher vision. So somebody tells the mother that I heard that so and so is doing this. And so just as the mother's mind turns, instantly she sees, knows what it is that is happening. Now this is a faculty which we find very often among people of a high spiritual development. Great saints seem to be able to know things without being physically given access to those things. A question is asked about things which are not in their domain of physical knowledge, and yet they know exactly what it is and can tell you what it is. So this is a kind of a power which is able to see. Now, what's the difference between the lower buddhi? The lower buddhi also sees, but in its seeing, it is attached to the physical senses. It can only see through the physical senses and is dependent on what the sense mind throws up as associations. Disengaged from this, and the same seeing in its higher station sees directly, not bound to physical senses. The actual process of seeing is exactly the same. Only you are freed from this dependence. So it's like somebody, as an example, as an analogy, somebody who has not very clear sight because of thickening of the eyes, inner cornea, and when they are asked to read what's on the text on the newspaper in small type, they say, wait, let me put on my specs. And when the specs are put on, now I can see clearly. The actual process of seeing is the same. It's this instrumentation in between. I'm dependent on the physical lenses to be placed in order to be able to see. But if I was not dependent on that physical machinery, I remove the machinery, I can see not only at a near distance, at a far distance, but I can see more widely. With the lenses, my vision is narrowed down to the size of the lenses. So you will see sometimes when the lenses are too narrow, the person has to move the head to be able to see the full picture. But you remove the narrow band of the lenses and the whole thing is seen in a single go. The effect, the analogy gives you some sense. The effect of shifting the consciousness to the higher buddhi is very similar. Suddenly now the narrowing effect of the physical senses, that is removed and the mind is free. Whatever it turns to look at, it can see immediately. In the lower buddhi, that same functioning now has been dimmed and narrowed because it is plugged in into the machinery of the body and the senses, and now dependent also on the associations of the sense mind. So in the pure form, the higher buddhi, of the higher buddhi, observation would be dominated or replaced by a vision, which could see without subservient dependence on the testimony of the sense mind and senses. You see that, you can get a sense of how the things are actually continuous. In fact, if you ask the question of the Kena Upanishad here, who permits the eyes to see? What is it that sees through our eyes? And you can see, in fact, the power of pure seeing is the seeing of the mind finally. It's mind seeing which now turns and engages with the eyes and through the eyes sees. You remove the mind and the eyes are only a sheet of skin on which light is falling, but there's no seeing taking place. It is because mind plugs into the machinery of the eyes that it's able to see. So the real seer is still this free working of the mind and the higher buddhi. So second, imagination. It's interesting, Sri Aurobindo follows a different order here than the orders in when he describes the lower buddhi. There he puts imagination, a rightly guided, chastened and rightly guided imagination, which then fills in further details once the whole thing is held in a higher consciousness, in a higher perception. But here he puts imagination right at the beginning because as a faculty, imagination is similar to this seeing power. In the lower buddhi, imagination comes after. You have drawn a right conclusion and now imagination supplements it. But in the higher functioning, in the higher buddhi, the faculty of imagination and the faculty of direct seeing are in fact very close because imagination also sees. So he puts imagination just after. Imagination would give place to the self-assured inspirations of the truth. Now consider how our imagination works. And if I ask you to now draw from your imagination some flying device, make an aeroplane which comes from your imagination. Draw a tree from your imagination. Draw an animal which nobody has seen or nobody has imagined before. And observe what happens to your mind's process. You want to draw this animal, and straight away a picture comes in your imagination. No, that's too similar to what I already know. This looks too similar to a camel. I throw it out. Again, I wait. A picture comes. This part is too similar to a dog. So I distort the picture slightly to make it dissimilar from what I have already seen or what is familiar. But where did the picture come from? You didn't actually create it. You waited for it and it popped in. Right? So something created an image and threw it in front. And that was the real imagination faculty. And you don't actually control that. Like the memory, you turn to wait and something comes. Now this is the lower functioning of the buddhi. In the higher functioning, we access that power directly. And that power is not creating blindly or distorting to make something different. It is seeing and it catches images. This is interesting, that is interesting, but it's seeing all the possibilities. And then what it sees, what it catches, that is articulated, turned into an image by the power of the inspiration which formulates. Now, if you see imagination, the word itself is image-ing, making picture. But when in your mind you saw the picture of this animal, you saw it from a certain angle, right? So I say, visualize or imagine in your mind a four-legged animal, and you have a picture, and you're seeing it from a certain angle. But the working of the intuition does not see a form from a distance. Imaging is a process of bringing into image, but what is before image is intuition which feels. It knows in identity. I feel like the elephantness of the elephant. I feel the strength and power of the elephant, and then it forms into a picture. If you observe all creative people who are masters in their field, they all function through this. They get into this experiential mode, not just creating images, an experience which then they have to translate into an image. You walk into a space, let's say as an interior decorator, you have to walk in here. You look at the space, the sizes of the room. Oh, this room is a bit longish. It's not exactly. Oh, this room is square. This has a high ceiling. This has a low ceiling, whatever it is. You don't start by saying, all right, because it's a high ceiling, I will put this here. Because it is a low ceiling, I will do this. That's a set formula. It is not real imagination. You want to create something new which has not been done before. So you go in, you feel the space of the room. You identify with the whole room space. And then the person says, you try to feel what the room wants. What the room wants to become. Okay? And then in that feeling comes a form which gradually concretizes. And you can say, oh, this room wants to be expressed in this way. This space wants to be formed in this way. This is the true creative process. And you will see it emerges from an experience, an identity, something which is essentially an intuitional working. So, an inspiration of the truth, something which is already there, it already exists, it is true to itself already, not something you've created by some fanciful distortion of imagination of pictures. It's already there, and that inspires. And in the inspiration is a self-assurance because you know it is true, you know it is right. It could not be otherwise. The created imagination has always a doubt. I created one picture, tomorrow I could create another picture. Which makes this special? Nothing. But when the inspiration comes, it comes with a force and you know it's true, you know it's the best, there's no doubt. You just go ahead and do it. So this is the nature of the imagination for the higher buddhi, that something already exists. It is the right thing at the right time, and it flows in and takes form within you as a identity of your consciousness, and from there it takes form of an image. So you see why Sri Aurobindo places imagination just after the observation, because there is a vision process involved in both. And then he comes to reasoning. Reasoning to the spontaneous discernment of relations. Now, what is this reasoning power? When you say, I observe this, I observe that, and then I reasoned a third thing. So you remember in the lower buddhi, it is reason from its rightfully observed data by deduction, induction, inference. You see two things, in between must be this. You see two things, following them must be this. You see two things, and these other two must be similar in pattern. What is the essence of this process? Seeing relationships. Putting this in relation to that, putting that in relation to the other, and deriving some insight which was not already present. In essence, in artificial intelligence, this is what so-called computer intelligence does. It looks at patterns and derives something which was not already known as a continuation of the pattern. And so you will see very often in intelligence tests, when they do IQ test, and they want to put a measure to your intelligence, they will give you patterns. This picture follows this, follows this, follows this. What's the next? You try to observe what is the pattern there, and you catch the pattern, and that's the next. You see a series of numbers 1 followed by 1, followed by 2, followed by 3, followed by 5, followed by 8, followed by 13. What's next? So you look for some pattern. And you see, oh, each number is the sum of the previous two. Okay, so the next should be 8 plus 13, 21. But perhaps there is another pattern in the series possible. You don't even bother. You just found one, you've done it. It's good enough for the test. But what is the essence of that process? You saw a relationship, tested the relationship, and then extended the relationship. So essentially, this power of reasoning is seeing relationships, and so the higher buddhi sees relationships directly, but there could be many relationships. It sees the right relation more profoundly and completely. Things you would have missed, it sees in a larger context. So for example, this comes especially when you're looking at very complex processes. You observe the stock market. Suddenly, this particular stock went up. So superficial understanding would say, oh yes, their profitability has gone up, therefore the stock value has gone up. A deeper understanding might see that there is a policy decision that the government has just made which changes so many things, which lead to this stock becoming more valuable in the future. You will see many layers of reasons. They just announced the monsoon will be slightly lower than the average of every year. Immediately it changes all the valuations of the current stocks because they are all tied to the monsoon performance in some way or other, some more, some less. So there are many layers of influences, and all of these are relating to this one thing, but also among themselves. And what you have in reality in the world is a complex grid network of interconnections of relations. And the complexity in real life is so great, the intellect is too narrow to follow it. Computers can be taught to process them. So we call this now, it's a whole new field of exploration called big data. You look at massive amounts of data and look for patterns of connections, relationships, and relationships of relationships across space, across time, across various kinds of contexts. Now this would be literally the job of thousands of people working to measure out, collate, accumulate, and pile up all this data to be able to draw some insight. That's what the computer is doing, only it's doing it much faster. It's to the human being, it's a slow process. To a computer, it's fast enough. But there's nothing really intelligent involved. You're just looking for patterns. But the kind of insights you can draw, it's amazing. Let me give just an example here. In many of the big stores, they track your buying patterns. And if you have enough data, let's say 1 million people buying for the last 10 years, you can go through that data and just look for patterns. And from the patterns, you can draw conclusions. And that's what the computer does. And the goal is for the computer to anticipate what you want to buy next. And then suggest that to you, force you to buy it from this place, attract you with some special discounts. So based on this big data, because yesterday I purchased this particular soap, tomorrow in my email comes this message, we are offering a 20% discount on this cleaning liquid detergent. Because they've seen this pattern, every time I have bought soap, it is a sign that my overall stock has dropped. And next I'm going to go and buy detergent. They know that, and they want to force you to come to their shop. An interesting thing which happened, and this created a bit of a scandal. This happened in the USA. A father received or saw in the mail an offer being mailed to his daughter who was 17 years old, and the offer was for special baby products for a lady who is pregnant. And he said, "What is this?" He filed against the company saying, "My daughter is underage and you're enticing her with products for a woman who's pregnant." And the fact was, he didn't know she was in fact pregnant. The company's computer knew it. The company didn't bother, it's all automated. The computer knew it, the father didn't know it. And it had tracked her pattern of purchases. She had just bought a series of things which fit the pattern that pregnant women follow in their purchases. She had switched suddenly from strong smelling soaps and perfumes to non smelling products. Because during pregnancy, the sense of smell is suddenly enhanced. It's too intense. And anytime the computer found this switch of pattern of product purchase, it detected a pattern subsequently of things bought for after childbirth, and it made the offer. Now the computer knew you more intimately than your own family members, and this is increasing, but what you see behind it is basically all measurements of relationships between things, patterns. And this is the essence of all intelligence functioning, at least in the lower domain of buddhi. Discerning relations. And so when the higher buddhi sees, it also has to deal with relations, but it deals with them in a completely different way. It sees all the connections and then is able to highlight from them which are currently the more important ones. And this is the problem with big data. There's so much data out there, so the computer has to sift through millions of things. But the human being does not bother to do that. Here is all this information, you look and you catch. So I give you an example here. And this was something narrated to us by the head of the engineering section in the ashram, Vishwanath. He was here from a very early childhood. He was practically the most important person in the engineering process from his childhood, being trained through and effectively became the head. He narrated how when they were constructing Golconda, there was an engineering problem. The architect had done all his designs. There was a load, a weight of so many things. They had to put pillars in a particular way to hold the load. But there was a particular gap. They were not allowed to put pillars there. And they could not calculate how to put pillars to manage the load above. It was an engineering problem. The architect had done his bit and gone away. But they had to follow because it was mother's dream project. So finally he said he went to the mother. And he told the mother, "We're having this problem. We can't solve it." So mother said, "Bring me your drawings." So he brought the engineering drawing. And the mother took a pen and marked a particular point and said, "Put a pillar here." So this man went back and did all his engineering calculations and found putting a pillar there solved the whole problem. And then he was stunned. Mother has no training in engineering. How did she know this? So he goes back to the mother and says, "Mother, how did you know? With all our training of engineering, we couldn't solve this problem. And you just pointed to this. How did you know?" And mother said, "Well, I just looked at the drawing and it was obvious this is where you had to put the pillar." It's so simple, isn't it? To the higher working of the buddhi, it sees all the patterns and instantly the intuition highlights, distinguishes this. This is the relation. This is the point of the stress. This is the correction. That's it. It's obvious. There's no thinking process. There's no processing of data which needs to be tracked and measured and analyzed. So reasoning would give place to the spontaneous discernment of relations. All relations are there. There's a discernment and it happens spontaneously, effortlessly. If you look at the actual working of our intellect, you will see how this is in fact happening behind the scenes. So let's say an expert is called to analyze a large amount of data. You have to analyze the company performances. You'll see people who go through the company annual reports, they don't read cover to cover and try to understand each sentence. They turn pages, go straight to certain numbers, scan through, pick this. Okay, here's a problem. You see, what's happening here is not that you need to go through everything. You're following a kind of a knack, an instinct. You're going through this looks okay, this looks okay. Here's something which doesn't look okay. How can this be? And then he asks the auditor goes, checks back, oh yes, we made a mistake. Or he discovers there is in fact something else happening, which is a cover up of some other problem. But you detect the problem just by scanning through without needing to go through in details and checking everything. There is a knack, a skill. I remember another incident which comes from the domain of science, narrated by Richard Feynman, one of the very famous physicists who developed many aspects of quantum mechanics. He was trying to work on the big problem at that time was how to unify all the forces into one grand theory. It was like an ultimate theory of everything. And he had an insight. He said, I knew if I could do it in this way, perhaps I would be able to get it. So he had an unusual insight approach. He went to Einstein and he described to Einstein that this is the thing I'm trying to do. And Einstein heard him out. He said, oh, it's a very interesting approach. But he said, but you will find it very difficult. And Feynman says afterwards, as he went on with the mathematics, every time he came up with some kind of jam, something he couldn't fit, something which was not compatible, it just couldn't work. And eventually he had to give up. And he says Einstein had just heard the concept and he knew that it would lead to some massive difficulties and it wouldn't work. Well, how did he know that? He actually asked this question in his autobiographical book. There is a power, as it sees this, it goes behind, it already glimpses, and it's happening in the higher buddhi, from which it reflects in the lower buddhi as a very quick focus. This is more important, that's not so important. You zoom in on what's important straight away. And this is what makes for these extraordinary people. They're able to somehow cut through all the clutter and go to exactly what's important. So reasoning would give place to the spontaneous discernment of relations. And conclusion from reasoning is a very different power. Reasoning leads you to something, but the conclusion which you draw from that something. Conclusion from reasoning would give way to intuition containing in itself those relations and not building laboriously upon them. So here's the relations scene, and then an intuition which holds all the relationships, containing in itself all those relationships, not building on them. So this is that station where, even though she is not an engineer, the mother looks at the drawings and immediately senses all the stresses and pressures. Now this is something which, again, all so-called geniuses tend to do. There's an interview which you will find on YouTube of an Indian student in the IITs. And he has this spontaneous ability of being able to solve problems very quickly. So he's asked how he does it. And he says, well, I just look at the problem and then it's obvious that this is the answer. How do you explain that? You don't. Even he does not explain it. But if he is asked to describe what it feels like when you look at it's obvious this is the answer, then you get something very interesting. So I have a friend who is a bit like that. And he describes how you look at an electronic circuit. Now, what's an electronic circuit? Electricity flowing through these different things. pieces, objects, devices. There's a resistor, and the flowing electricity experiences resistance. It can't flow easily. What comes through is like water being fed through a very tightly coiled pipe or some pipe which has blocks. And what comes through is a reduction in the pressure on the other side. You have a capacitor, which is like a rubbery tank. So water presses in and it expands and fluctuates in its movement. You have an inductor, which is a coil, which has a similar effect. It has a rubbery effect on the magnetic field of the electricity. It dulls the rapidity of change of electricity. If there's a fluctuation, a sharp spike, it somehow dulls it, narrows it, smoothens it. Or you have a transistor, which is like a gate, like a sluice gate. Water comes through and you have a control. You make it go more or less. A small variation here produces a large variation here. I'm describing to you the fundamentals of electronics. If you can get the sense of what these parts do, you look at a circuit and you can feel what the electricity flows through would be like. I look at the circuit and I say, oh, here the pressure is weak. Here the flow is strong. Here this is happening. Two movements, two pressure points are clashing or adding to each other. I can feel it. I can look at an electric circuit and feel how the flow will be like and tell you exactly what the outcome will be. So the technical problem will be, the question might be, what is the value that you should put for this resistor so that the voltages are all balanced? Well, I look at it and I can feel this should be about half of that. That's what it feels like in the pressure. I write the number. You go through the calculation through the normal formula, you will get exactly the same number. What the calculation and the formula does is apply some kind of a functioning of the lower buddhi. It matches relationships, converted the relationships to formula, applied them mechanically. What the other side did was it felt the flow of relations, energies, pressures, felt what was in thing in the balance, and there it was. I'm trying to show you how the two are related. In fact, it's not something so dramatically different. It is a pure working of a faculty which is implied in the lower working anyway. It's what makes the lower working possible. And so there is this experience of an intuition, and the nature of intuition is always, you know, in identity. You can feel it because you're one with it. There's an intuition containing in itself those relations and not building on them laboriously. And this is the nature of that genius's insight. He solves the problem. It's so easy, it's obvious. So reasoning would give place to spontaneous discernment of relations. This is what it is. This is important. That is not so important. This is what influences that. Conclusion from reasoning would give place to an intuition containing in itself those relations and not building laboriously upon them. And then finally, above all this comes judgment. After all the conclusions have been made from all the reasonings, from all the observations, everything is placed. Now you have to make a judgment. Is all this valid? Is all this true? Is all this worthwhile? Judgment would give way to a thought vision in whose light the truth would stand revealed without the mask which it now wears and which our intellectual judgment has to penetrate. So you look at, I was sitting, was it only yesterday, in the Supreme Court for a hearing, and I was watching maybe 70, 80 lawyers all sitting in the room, listening to some people arguing out their case. There was a lawyer who was talking. He was saying, oh, so and so said this, they did this, we signed this contract, then that happened, that happened. The judges asked questions, they went back and forth. And I'm listening, and we could make out fragments of what the thing was. And after he had finished everything, a senior lawyer came, someone I had had occasion to interact with earlier, and I saw in him a brilliant, incisive intellect, the kind that I would admire. He stood up, and you could see something extraordinary happen. First, he engaged the judges. He literally gripped them and compelled them against their will to sit down and listen to him. They were not going to allow him to listen. And he spoke certain words, and you could feel a kind of a magnetic energy reaching out, seizing on the judges. And the whole body language was unwilling, but they had to yield. Then he said, then finally the judge says, all right, but you can only add what is in supplement to what the other lawyer said. This man paused very dramatically and said, but I have to clarify some of the things which have been said. I cannot just put supplementary content. It has to be put in a larger context. Okay, it sounded like an argument, but then he began to speak. And then as he spoke, it was like the whole picture of what the case was suddenly became clear. And I'm sitting there, I have no idea of the background of that case. I had heard all the previous arguments. It made, you saw fragments. Suddenly here it was like a big picture, canvas. Cleared, all the clutter gone. This. The problem is here. And then how the problem is affecting, where did it develop, the whole sequence historically. Up to here it was clear. Then this decision took place which closed all the problem. Upon this now all these problems came. And then he went on, and at the end he said, this was the judgment passed by the previous judge in the Supreme Court. And the judgment is flawed for this reason. And it was so incisive. You heard him and you said, wow, it's so simple, it's so obvious. This is how it is. That kind of clarity that he brought, you could feel conviction in it. I'm giving this as an example because it is something which is happening in a mundane domain of life. But there's a huge clutter of information. In a Supreme Court, you go to any case, you will find this big a pile of papers. And the judges are typically going to go through a dozen cases in a day in detail, each of which has a pile of papers like this, a meter tall at least. And that means like literally 10,000, 20,000 pages. They're supposed to have prepared for all of them the night before. Obviously, they don't read them all. They cannot. So there is an executive summary which is given. All of this is part of the way the whole legal system works. But with all that, how are you to know who is right and who's wrong? Because each one has piled their side with so many documents to supplement. There has to be something which cuts through. And straight away, this is clear. This is not true. There has to be something which cuts through. And this was the experience we had when this lawyer spoke up. It was not about this party is wrong and that party is right. It separated from the confusion of all the massive data. It separated all the clutter and highlighted straight, this is the core of the problem. It is this ability which I said, my God, this is the kind of lawyers we should have. Of course, the same power could be turned around and used to subvert the truth. That's the problem of intellectual argument. But he had the power not only to see, but to articulate with clarity, to make others see with clarity. Because in his mind it was clear, he had an experience of clarity, and he was able to project that into the people listening to him. And that's why I described in detail first how he gripped them with a certain magnetic compelling force. It's that same power of conveying, influencing others through which the clarity of his mind was projected. Sri Aurobindo speaks of these two faculties, Vyapti and Prakamya. Vyapti is a kind of a seeing of what is happening far away. Prakamya is a seeing in which you also have an influence. So, Prakamya is in fact the faculty by which we convince people. Every time you have an argument or a discussion with somebody and you want to convince them of a certain viewpoint, or they convince you of a viewpoint, this faculty is operational. Some part of your consciousness, mind, emotions, life force, enters and changes something in the other. And then you see differently and you accept or not. This is a faculty of conveying thought, feeling, experience, even projecting and imprinting a whole learning experience into another person. That suddenly the person experiences this capacity and it's there and they can do it. This is in fact how all real learning is transmitted behind the scenes. But what you see here is the ability to project a clarity of vision that he had, and that was so convincing. What we're discussing here is the clarity of the vision, not the power to project it, but the clarity. Judgment would give way to a thought vision in whose light the truth would stand revealed without the mask that it now wears. Right now, the truth is masked with all this data, and that's why I took this example of a court case where you have all these documents, 20, 30,000, I don't know how many it would be for a pile 1 meter high, all cross-referenced and indexed. Each one used in a way to slant your judgment in a particular direction. And through it all, here, this is what it is. The truth would stand revealed without the mask. And when the mask is there, what does the lower buddhi have to do? It has to read all that, it has to cut through, has to put them in right place, cut through all the distortions and see what it is and try to understand what's behind it, which our intellectual judgment has to penetrate. The higher buddhi does not have to penetrate. It simply turns the thought vision, sees the light of the truth. That's it. It's revealed. When the mother had to deal with people, she always saw what was behind. She always knew. And then what she had to do in terms of action was also a right action in that truth light. And the right action sometimes was, from the human lower buddhi's point of view, wrong action. And this is the problem. When you see things from a higher light, you also see that the right action in that higher light may be different from the lower buddhi. And I give an example here. This was narrated by Robi Ganguly when he was the head of the press for many years. But when he was a child, he said how many of the children used to be excited with football matches. There was no TV in those days. So to go to a live football match by some famous players was always a bit of an excitement for the young people. So some big football match was to take place in Chennai, Madras in those days. And some of the boys, some of the students went to the mother and said, "Mother, can we go?" And mother said, "Yes." Then Robi Ganguly went, and "Mother, can I go?" And mother said, "No." And she explained that she didn't want students to go out because they would be exposed to influences which were not so healthy. But then Robi Ganguly asked, "Mother, you said yes to those people. Why are you saying no to me?" And then mother explained, when they came and asked me, they had already decided to go. Very simply stated, they had already decided to go. She saw that they had decided to go. She saw that if she said no, next time they would simply not ask. And the transparency of their openness to her would now be covered by a layer. They would fear, they would be afraid of a no and would not come to her. And so the right thing at that point was to allow them to go, even though going was not good for them. Because something more precious was involved, which was her relationship with them. And when Robi Ganguly went, he went with an open heart, genuinely asking. She saw that she could say no and he would not mind, he would take it in the right way. And so she said no to him. Now, from a lower buddhi perspective, oh, mother is so whimsical. To some people, she says yes, some people, she says no for exactly the same thing. For the same age boys, she said yes to some, she said no to another. But because it cannot see what's behind. But when there is this direct seeing in the light of the truth, the thing is clear, there is a clear judgment. It also takes into account something much bigger, more inclusive, because it's seeing the full picture. So judgment gives way to a thought vision in whose light the truth would stand revealed without the mask which it now wears and which our intellectual judgment has to penetrate. So much of mother's actions were impenetrable to the narrow intellectual judgment. I remembered somebody, a senior person in the ashram, commenting that mother said of her paintings, some of the paintings she had done, which are placed in Sraddhalu's room outside, above those tigers. And to some of it, she said, "Oh, you can just put them away, it doesn't matter." "But mother, these are your paintings." She said, "Yeah, but they don't matter." On the other hand, so this was for them, it was an excuse to say paintings have no value. On the other hand, when it came to paintings which Huta had done in her hand, and mother said, "I will paint through your hands," she gave them so much value. She said they had to be preserved as if they were living beings, because they actually were living beings. And she said once in the night, in a higher consciousness state, the beings from that box in which all the paintings were kept, they all came to her, and she narrates the whole thing around that. And she gave it so much importance. She wanted people to stand before them, to meditate, to receive them in a certain way, and all that. Now, and about her own paintings, she said, "Oh, they don't matter." So, to the surface mind, it's a contradiction. What is this? And the fact is, those paintings the mother had done while she was an artist in Paris did not represent the manifestation of a new consciousness. They were highly skillful paintings of a certain grade. That's it. They were not representatives of the new consciousness and then entry points, openings to the new world. That's what she had done with Huta's paintings. And so those had immense value. The others had at best historical value, except some. Somewhere she had captured a special consciousness. One of the paintings she had was of somebody who was a close friend of her while she was in France. The lady died during childbirth. And many years later, when Maggie Litchi came and met the mother recognized her as that woman, and she said to her, "Oh, you have come back so soon." So Maggie didn't understand what it was. But a few months later, mother told her this and then gave her that painting she had done of that woman as she was earlier. She had kept it with her, knowing that she would meet her again. So when she gave it, it was with this background. If you look at that painting, you will see something quite extraordinary. It's a small painting this size. It's all there now in the book of the mother's paintings. You look at that and you can feel the personality of that woman. It's as if she has penetrated to capture the soul of that woman. And there's something very special there. It's as if she kept that woman with her when she kept the painting and called her back in the new life, in this new body. There's a whole thing which you can feel behind it. And so there are some exceptional things also. And so she valued it for that reason, because she carried that connection with her physically. Now again, these are all things which one can see in that thought vision, in whose light the truth would stand revealed without the mask. And this is instant, spontaneous for the higher buddhi. And finally, memory. And about memory, from the lower memory to the higher memory, we've already discussed this, so I won't elaborate. While memory too would take upon itself that larger sense given to it in Greek thought, and be no longer a paltry selection from the store gained by the individual in his present life, but rather the all-recording knowledge which secretly holds and constantly gives from itself everything that we now seem painfully to acquire, but really in this sense remember, a knowledge which includes the future no less than the past. So you remember we discussed about memory, how actually the real faculty of memory is behind the veil. But that real faculty of memory has a much larger scope, massive scope, which here he is revealing. That larger sense given to it in Greek thought. Now in Greek thought, a memory is not just this little thing which I remember from this life, but the totality, the sum of all that has happened, which is held as if in some wider cosmic consciousness. We have a similar idea in the Puranic tradition where everything has been symbolically represented and it is given as Chitragupta. So we are told Chitragupta is this fellow sitting in heaven and he writes down everything that happens. Everything you spoke, everything you did, we tell children. He is writing it all down and one day you're going to have to face him. The name tells you the secret. Chitra is picture, Gupta, secret. The secret imaging, the secret memory in which everything is held. There's nobody sitting down writing in words. It's the whole experience of all that happens which is retained in the backdrop behind the scenes, from which all functioning of memory draws. Every time you remember, you turn in, you want to remember, that inner faculty draws from that store and brings here. So, no longer the paltry selection of the store gained by the individual in this present life, in his present life. It's not just my life and the memory held in my physical brain. It is that massive store of everything that happened, including everyone's life experience, not just mine. And the all recorded knowledge which secretly holds Chitragupta and constantly gives from itself everything. And when we say we remember, he says actually the remembrance is not remembrance, it is painfully acquiring from that store. Acquiring, that's what we call remembering. And that knowledge includes the past, all that happened and all that tried to happen, which is also there to be recorded. The present, all that is happening and all that tried to happen but could not make it. And the future and all that's trying to happen, including that which is likely to eventually happen. All of it is there. And then there's a footnote against this memory of the future. He says, in this sense, the power of prophecy has been aptly called a memory of the future. What does it mean when somebody says, I prophesy that this will happen? It means in some part of his consciousness, this has already happened. Right? You see that, you feel that, and you articulate it as, yes, it's inevitable. It's going to happen because it's already happened in this memory. So there's a memory where, among all future possibilities, the thing which is going to happen is felt as something already done. And this is the nature of memory to the higher buddhi. And if this is how the higher buddhi is going to function, as far as it concerns the power of observation, imagination, reasoning, and conclusions from reasoning, and judgment, and memory, all of these faculties. Then Sri Aurobindo concludes in this paragraph, certainly we are intended to grow in our receptivity to this higher faculty of truth conscious knowledge. It's part of the purpose, object of our evolutionary movement. We are intended to grow into it. It's not just something that is sitting there hidden away. But its full and unveiled use is as yet the privilege of the gods and beyond our present human stature. So we get glimpses of it. In fact, it is what allows the lower functioning of the buddhi. But the full access, unveiled, is still the privilege of the gods. And beyond our present human stature, but the human stature is going to grow closer to the divine stature, and this faculty will become more and more direct, more and more full, more and more unveiled, as it already is functioning from behind the veils. And this is the point I want to highlight, the continuity, that all our current faculties are really reflections or distorted workings of these higher faculties of the buddhi. And so this gives us now a context of what we mean by the buddhi, this understanding which we have to now purify and allow to function more and more directly, for which the discussion will continue next Friday. And he will explain precisely this, that all the impurity and confusion, all the wrong working is only impurity and confusion of the right working. So it's not like we have to train ourselves to develop the right working. We have rather to remove the confusions and the impurities. And the right working which is already there will begin to act more and more directly. We'll take that up next Friday. We have just about 5 minutes because some of you have to go for the march past. If there are any questions or comments, we can take them now. In the practice of the integral yoga, one of the most effective ways for developing this direct working of the higher buddhi is to train the mind to become silent and then to consciously open the mind to the higher light. And this is an experience one has quite concretely. The higher consciousness fills the mind as a light. It illumines the domain of mind and you feel it brightly lit up. And in that light, all these workings tend to happen more and more directly. So you see, the process actually is so simple. All this background is for us to understand, but the process by which we actually do it is so simple. And this is the reason why you could see people who came to Sri Aurobindo and the mother rapidly developing all of these capacities within sometimes a few years. And Sri Aurobindo, in one of his letters to Nirodvaran, points to the effectivity of the Yoga Shakti, Yoga force, by giving the example of somebody who came as the tabla player of, what is his name? He came as tabla player of, who was in Trezor Nursing Home, the singer in Trezor Nursing Home. The man who was singing, Dilip Kumar Roy. Yeah. He came as a tabla player for Dilip Kumar Roy, as somebody who had not trained the intellect at all, not trained any of his faculties of the senses, or of his sense mind, or his artistic powers. He just knew to play the tabla, and that was it. And Sri Aurobindo points out how after coming here, within a year, this man is doing some of the most extraordinary paintings. Not only of a high physical skill and standard, but a very high standard of content and inspiration. And he says if an ordinary man with that kind of starting point, straight from the village, all he knew was to play the tabla, could be lifted to this height of art within a year, that is evidence of the power of the yogic force. There were others, of course, who were even more dramatic. Within a year or two of coming, they were spouting the high inspired poetry, playing musical instruments of a high order, painting, writing literature, and all of some of the highest standard with zero background or training before. And from the level they were at to have reached within a year or two to this is extraordinary. But this is possible to all of us. And the means is precisely this, to quiet the whole working of our current consciousness and open to the higher consciousness to fill it. And as it fills it, it brings into us all the capacities and powers of the higher consciousness, which are already there, natural to it. One of the earliest sadhaks recalls how when he came here and he was accepted by Sri Aurobindo, first Sri Aurobindo asked him a few questions. Why you want to do sadhana, what you are seeking. And then after that, he briefly explained in what way sadhana was different from the other paths. Then when the man accepted that this is what he wanted, Sri Aurobindo said, though there is no formal initiation, you are accepted. And then Sri Aurobindo walked up to the window and looked out. And then called this man and pointed to the pots. Now Sri Aurobindo at that time was staying in the place where now they have the stance room, just above the reception. So from there he pointed to the pots which had just been washed and kept in the sun to dry. And he said, you must become like this. Open yourself to the light of the sun, to the light of the truth. and let it fill you and work in you. So obviously, in this case, it was to open to Sri Aurobindo himself as the very embodiment of that supramental consciousness. But the method was precisely this. You open yourself and receive and hold what? The light of the highest truth. So we can end with this, with a brief concentration. Om. 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 Om.